Welcome to Theology Thursday, an ecumenical space for students to discuss matters of faith and theology.
I'm your host, Connor Grubbs.
I am your co-host, Ryan Mock.
And I'm your co-host, Johnny Grubbs.
So, we're finally back. I think this is the earliest in the day that we've ever recorded a podcast.
That's right. It is 8:55 a.m.
And for most people listening, they're like, that's not that early. But I'm more of a night owl, so I don't know, this just doesn't feel right, but we'll see how it goes.
I am also a night owl, but when you have kids, it doesn't matter. You're still up early.
Yeah, technically this is late for me because I worked last night.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I haven't slept.
You just got off the night shift. Well, yeah. The thing is, we used to record on Wednesday nights, but the past couple Wednesday nights have proven not to work because twice in a row, Ryan has not shown up to record.
Yeah.
And me and Johnny were here one of those times, just
I'm calling him out on the podcast.
I'm calling him out on the podcast. And here's why I'm calling him out on the podcast. All right, 2 weeks ago, instead of doing this episode that we're doing right now, we were supposed to do more apologetics. We did one of Johnny's sermons. So, usually, Johnny's here with us, but we're
a heretic.
We're able to, filter the heresy. This was just, a straight hour of heresy. And then the next week, we just didn't even release anything. The fans are probably so confused, and it's all your fault, Ryan.
So be it.
And you don't even feel bad.
I have no comment. I have no words.
Yeah, and that's what you would, respond when I'd, confront you about it. Over you, no comment. You just respond, no. And Johnny knows I got a little heated about it.
Yeah, he was really kind of peeved.
I mean, especially the second time, I was like, really?
Yeah, well, it's the past 3-4 weeks have just been weird for me. Just new things coming up and me not understanding my own schedule. And so that's why it's been weird. And really where I went wrong is I didn't give Connor notice beforehand that I was going to be either late, incredibly late, or I just wasn't going to know if I was going to be there or not. I should have given Connor notice.
Yes, thank you.
Well,
I accept your apology.
I'm not apologizing. No, I'm kidding. I'm sorry.
Is.
So yeah, that's my excuse.
Yeah, well, no, and that was what irritated me. I even said that to Johnny. I said, it's not that he's not showing up or that he's late. It's just that he's not communicating with me ahead of time.
It was all about consideration. But you're considering it now, so
I guess it's okay. So we will allow you to continue being the co-host.
Yeah,
really,
don't demote me.
I want you to apologize.
Man, almost there.
Almost got that promotion, bud.
I want you to apologize to the listeners for us not having the episode last week.
Oh, I'm sorry, listeners.
I don't know if they forgive you or not. This isn't a two-way thing.
I hope Jesus forgives me.
Yeah, he's got a great capacity for that.
Yeah, he does. The listeners, on the other hand, we may not have a podcast anymore.
That's what really matters.
You know what?
If I receive the audience forgiveness.
We're so close to wrapping up the season. We're almost at 50 episodes, and when we hit episode 50, that's the season finale. So
we should do a Q&A about our lives and ministries.
I don't think anybody cares about our lives or ministries.
You don't think our listeners are like, hey, how did you come to believe this way?
What does Johnny eat for breakfast every morning?
No, that's not what I'm talking
Those are the
about.
important questions.
I'm talking about what do you eat for pivotal breakfast? Time in your ministry?
But none of us have had pivotal times. Look. What did you have for breakfast this morning?
I haven't had anything for breakfast. I'm waiting to go to Chick-fil-A. I was going to have a kind protein bar, but then you guys said we're going to Chick-fil-A.
As opposed to a mean protein bar?
Oh my gosh,
you better watch out for those. They sure will get you.
I should appreciate that joke as a dad, and I didn't. So.
Yeah.
Because it came from Connor.
Someday. Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin Apologetics. Intro to Apologetics. Mind you, this is really just a launching point for your study in apologetics, but this is part 2, and we're going to talk about the second type of apologetics, evidential apologetics.
That's right. So last time we talked about apologetics, we talked about classical apologetics, and I kept talking and talking. I didn't realize we were taking so long on just that one method of defending the faith. And so Connor was like, hey, we need to wrap this up. So we decided to split it up a little bit. and take a week to explain each methodology gets its own week. So last time we talked about classical apologetics, we gave some examples of classical arguments. For example, the teleological argument, which says that the universe is fine-tuned, and because it appears that way, it clearly has a designer, and we believe that designer is God. We looked at the cosmological argument that says everything has a beginning, and if everything has a beginning, it must have something that caused it to happen, and we believe that to be God. And we talked about strengths and weaknesses of classical apologetics. Today, as Connor pointed out, we are going to be talking about evidential apologetics. And to kind of give an example about what evidential apologetics focuses on, I'm going to give a scenario. And Connor and Johnny are going to have to respond to this scenario.
I'm up for it.
They think how they would respond. So, you're sitting in class.
Okay, I'm sitting in class.
Yes, you're like in middle school, because
I don't want to go back there.
Go back to those great 4 years of your life in middle school. And I'm sharing this because this happened to me once.
What? That it lasted 4 years?
Well,
did you get held back?
5 years. But this specific scenario happened to me in middle school. You're sitting in class, and you hear people talking about the Bible. And you join in on the conversation because you like the Bible's pretty cool, and you are a Christian. So you join in, and you all are chatting about religion and the Bible, and this one girl says, how could anybody believe that the things in the Bible are true because, and here's the reason that she gives, because the Bible is so old and has gone through so many languages for translations, and obviously they must have messed up somewhere in their translations, going from the ancient Greek all the way through to Latin to English. They must have messed up in the translation somewhere. So how could you believe the Bible to be true? How would you respond to that?
Well, I've read some books and stuff on like the Bible, but I'd have to have evidence to give her to like explain like historical, like this is why it's reliable. But like, one, it hasn't been translated through that many languages, and two, we have most of the original text.
Johnny?
Yeah, I would say something similar. I think that we do have originals of everything, and everything that's been translated has come from that. Obviously, we'd have to talk a little bit about canonization and why that works. But, I mean, ultimately, like, when I think about it, because I think about, like, my wife's from Brazil, and she speaks Portuguese and stuff like that, and I've learned a little bit about languages and translations and stuff like that, I would totally admit right away that the English translations aren't perfect, but that they give the idea of each passage the same way. You know, a translator gives the idea of what somebody said, when they're translating. It may not be the word for word exactly what they said. That you can't do that when you're translating, but it certainly is the same thought.
So, yeah, I think both those answers are great answers. Obviously, this girl that I had this encounter with was very misinformed about how translations work. And Connor was right when he said that we have original manuscripts. In fact, we have over 4,000 manuscripts that date within 100 years of Christ's crucifixion, which is really good for historical reliability if you compare it to other documents in history and historical figures in history. So we have a whole bunch of original manuscripts that we don't need to translate through several different languages to get to English. We just need to translate straight from the ancient Greek to English, or the ancient Hebrew to English. It's as simple as that.
So feasibly, you could challenge this girl, be like, listen, the originals are out there. Why don't you go read them? Get the scans and learn ancient Greek and Hebrew.
And I think it's interesting how there are other ancient texts that the original stuff weren't as close as you just said, like just within 100 years of Jesus, yet people accept them without question.
Yeah. Take, for example, Julius Caesar. The closest documents that we have discussing several wars that he had been involved in and about 50 years before Christ, we have 9 documents that discuss this that were written 9 centuries after it occurred. And yet we take that as like
History.
History, like matter of fact history, yet we have 4,000 manuscripts that date within 100 years of Jesus, and people are like, well, did that really happen? And that's silly. It's really inconsistent to think that way. So yes, the looking at manuscripts and stuff like that is really good evidence that the New Testament's reliable, that Jesus really did exist. And that's really the core of evidential apologetics, is looking at evidence. Evidence from history, evidence in archaeology, in ancient manuscripts, and really there's a whole bunch of other examples. But we're just looking at evidence to prove that Jesus is real, that Jesus died on the cross, that Jesus rose again, and that Christianity is true. So, there's all sorts of stuff to talk about with that. A good example is prophecy. Do you know how many prophecies were in the Old Testament about Jesus?
I forget, but it was a good bit.
It was a good bit. Do you know, Johnny?
I don't know off the top of my head exactly how many.
Yeah, by the way, I don't know either the exact number. But there's so many prophecies in the Old Testament that talked about Jesus that, guess what, were fulfilled in Jesus. And that is an example, that is evidence that Jesus was who he says he was, that the Bible is inspired by God, I would think. I'd use that as evidence.
Yeah, there are a lot of things in Isaiah and some of the other prophets that just speak so directly about Jesus, and so specifically about how he was going to die, about where he was going to be born, about all sorts of stuff that it's just like way too many details to be coincidence.
In my Bible study the other day, my personal Bible study, one of my resources had a chart, and it was like just 12 of them, that were fulfilled in the life of Christ, and I'm sure there's more, and it was really cool to see, like reading Zechariah, and then reading like how it came to fruition in the New Testament and so forth.
Yeah.
By the way, I did some research. There are over 400 prophecies about Jesus in the Old Testament.
Thank you, Connor. And all of them, were they fulfilled
Yes.
in Jesus? Yeah.
Every single one of them.
Jesus fulfilled all those prophecies. And if you don't believe us, do the research for yourself, and you'll see.
The odds of that happening are slim to none. I mean, like, I've heard some weird examples that, like, say some crazy example, this is more likely to happen than, and I can't remember any of them, so I shouldn't have gone that direction, but I've heard examples.
It's like if you dump nickels in Texas, your odds of finding the one that I marked, and that's like the same one.
Yeah.
That's what
of, like, these prophecies.
Something like that. Yeah. Now, the math is very much in favor of Christianity being true.
Another example that we could look at are miracles. Miracles performed by Jesus in the New Testament as evidence that Jesus was more than just a man.
But Ryan,
what?
I didn't see those miracles happen, and I haven't seen any miracles in my life.
That's
Actually,
right.
I have. I'm playing the devil's advocate.
Maybe you haven't seen miracles like your coffee right now turn into wine. I can't do that.
We don't need that to happen either.
But hundreds and hundreds of eyewitnesses firsthand saw Jesus perform miracles. Jesus, whenever he performed miracles, he was always surrounded by people. Hundreds of them. Again, going back to coincidences and what are the odds? All these people claiming that Jesus did these things. Now, again, if you don't believe in the reliability of the New Testament, then we'd have to argue about that again. About, does the New Testament actually portray events that actually did happen? Are the New Testament writers lying? We can get into a discussion about that, but if you want to talk about miracles, people witnessed what Jesus did. Just as people witnessed the resurrection. People, there are many eyewitnesses to Jesus's resurrected body. There's over 500 And a lot of critics say stuff like, well, it was like a group hallucination.
That's really stupid.
Right. That at least 500 different people had the same experience of hallucinating Jesus and his resurrected body, all at different times, or different places, but basically the same thing. That is silly to say that. That it was a group hallucination.
Right, because from what I remember from studying this is like there have been group hallucinations, but almost all the time it was like a bunch of people in a similar circumstance. Most of them were starved, were in like really bad situation.
Right.
It originated with somebody, and they all decided to believe it together, like come around this idea. But it was all like they were all in like. What these people are like in different places at different times talking about the resurrection, and they're all saying this. It's not like they're all coming together and like, doing drugs and then like, hey, I see the happy man too. It's like
right.
There he is.
And living in a time where saying that they believe in the resurrected Christ is not going to bode well for them.
Yeah,
right.
that's huge. And I remember studying that too as part of the reliability of the New Testament. Some of the things, and this is throughout the New Testament, like the way that the writers wrote in such a way that it's like, they shouldn't have written that way.
Right, like the women discovering Jesus in the tomb.
Exactly. It's like...
Nobody cared what women had to say back then.
Right,
So.
but because it happened, they wanted to be true to that, and so they did it even though it could, so...
Yeah. If you wanted people to believe what you wrote, you would have written it a certain way. But...
They don't have any of those hallmarks.
Writers, they weren't like that. They didn't go on cultural tropes and expectations. Like, for example, what Connor said, the woman discovering the empty tomb first, they would have used men because men were reliable back then. I put that in quotation marks. One of the things that Connor mentioned earlier and Johnny agreed with was the disciples after the resurrection. Obviously, many critics say, Jesus, the empty tomb. There was an empty tomb, but maybe it was because the disciples stole the body of Jesus. Is that possible? Would that have happened?
I mean, not really. There were 2 guards in front of it.
Okay, there's 2 guards, yeah.
There was a giant stone.
There's a giant stone.
It's kind of difficult to do it.
Hard to move.
And they had nothing to gain by doing that.
Right, that's the big thing. They had nothing to gain. And we know from reading the scriptures and studying history that many of Jesus' early followers were martyred. People who firsthand talked to Jesus and lived with Jesus, they are martyred for their faith. And if they knew that this whole Jesus thing was a lie, if they knew that Jesus didn't actually rise from the dead, that they actually stole the body of Jesus, is that something that they would have died for?
And possibly, but if we are to believe the account of Scripture, which again, I think that's a whole other episode for another time, is looking at why it's reliable. But let's just assume that we're taking that as historical fact. That wasn't who the disciples were. They were cowards. They were in hiding after Jesus died on the cross because they were like, "Uh-oh, we're next."
Right.
They were afraid. And also, Scripture tells us that the authorities fabricated this story about the disciples because they knew the tomb was empty.
Right.
Even his enemies admitted that the tomb was empty.
Yeah. So crazy events, crazy circumstances that really point to the authenticity of this story of Jesus rising from the dead. And really what critics have to say in response to the resurrection really fall short of attacks against the resurrection. So again, resurrection, all the events surrounding that is all really good evidence for Christianity. I want to change the topic a little bit here because I think that covers that discussion pretty well. By the way, just a few book recommendations for Evidential Apologetics. On my plate, I put Reasonable Faith by William Lane Craig.
Good one.
Okay. William Lane Craig also goes into classical arguments, like the cosmological argument. He likes that a lot, but he also talks a lot about the resurrection. Also, just a side note on William Lane Craig, you won't agree with everything that he says, and I there's quite a few things that I disagree with him on. So just be wary reading his stuff. But as far as apologetics go, he's pretty solid. Do y'all have any book recommendations or resources for that?
I was gonna say The Case for Christ by Lee Strobel, and he also focuses on the resurrection. I think we just had Resurrection Sunday recently, and this episode would have released closer to it had you not screwed everything up. But I think Evidential Apologetics, the resurrection is one of the key events, right? And there's actually a lot of evidence surrounding that event, that Jesus actually did come back from the dead. And so I think it's interesting because that's all of Christianity hinges on that happening. And there's a lot of evidence around that. So Lee Strobel does a great job. He set out to disprove Christianity, but once he finally had all the evidence, it was just so overwhelmingly for it,
right,
that he actually became a Christian. And there's a movie, too, if you're not into reading. The movie's actually really good. Sometimes Christian movies can be super cheesy, but The Case for Christ was actually a great movie. And his kind of story and his journey was really formative in my faith walk, so I highly recommend that.
This is a classic, but Josh McDowell's More Than a Carpenter is like super good. I love that argument. Basically, like, if people couldn't ride the fence about Jesus standing before him, they had to be like, you're crazy, or you're actually who you say you are. Like, why do we know he existed as a historical figure? Why do we get that right today? Just be like, oh, he was a good teacher. No, I mean, like, he has to be one or the other. Like logically, we have to make a decision about who we think Jesus is. And I've challenged people with that before in conversations. They'll be like, well, I appreciate Jesus. And I'm like, no. Like, he made some outrageous claims, like either he was who he said he was or he isn't. So that's a great book kind of breaking that down. But I also recommend Fast Facts on Defending Your Faith. That's by John Ankerberg and John Weldon. I didn't know who they were until I started Bible college. Their book doesn't... It contains all these schools of thoughts that we're talking about, but it doesn't break them down into sections like that. It talks about, like, what do you do when you're combating atheism? What do you do when you're talking about the resurrection? So it does it more in sections about topics within Scripture.
Yeah.
But then it weaves all of these schools of thought together and giving you different responses that are very practical.
Awesome. And then also I would say don't be afraid to just use the internet as a resource.
But also be afraid to use the internet.
Okay, so yeah, there's obviously there's a disclaimer there. Don't be afraid of the power. Use the power of Google, and Google could be on your side, especially for quick reference. I use the internet all the time, researching stuff. But as Johnny said, be cautious because you need to make sure you're using right sources, credible sources.
I thought Google was a credible source.
And
if all of a sudden you're reading a 14-year-old on Yahoo Answers, you're getting in trouble.
Right, so use credible sources. And
it's basically what this show is.
And also be careful that you represent the other side properly. So change the discussion just a tiny bit, but still in the realm of evidential apologetics. I want to ask this question to the both of you, and we could discuss it. Should we engage in scientific discussions with apologetics?
It's a really fascinating question because we're
talking about evolution, the Big Bang.
Yeah.
We engage in those kinds of conversations?
Well, I'll let Johnny answer first.
I think not. Here's why I think not. I think that science, while of course it's explaining things that God and systems that God put into place, to me, like, using science and apologetics is kind of like trying to use your cell phone to play golf. It's like they're two different things. It's like you don't use that for that. It's not the right tool for what you're setting out to do. So, and I think that by trying to enmesh these spheres together, what we're saying is you have to make scientific conclusions about the origin of species or stuff like that to believe in Scripture. And I think that that's a little far to say. There's a lot of people in certain parts of the world that will never, ever even think about their scientific views on the origin of species. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because of the way that they receive the gospel, the culture that they live in, and the you know what I mean. So to enmesh them, I think is inappropriate. I don't think that you can never talk about how the two run alongside each other. I just don't think that the lines intersect.
Yeah. So to an extent, I definitely agree, because I don't think it should be used as the argument that's going to win that person over. Because frankly, when you get to that, it goes back to what I said on our first apologetics episode, is you can win the argument but lose the person. But I think more times than not, if you're talking to somebody who's really into science, you're just going to lose the argument. I love, the sentiments of Answers in Genesis and some of the material they put out, but the Ken Ham versus Bill Nye debate was just like, oh, this is painful to watch, because he wasn't prepared. He didn't go in really knowing what he was going to have thrown at him, and at the end of the day, Bill Nye knows a lot more about science than Ken Ham does. And so it was just kind of, well, this is embarrassing. Like, at the end of the day, these things are secondary. You have to start with the gospel.
Right.
So I will wholeheartedly agree with that. However, I will also say that I do believe studying science and seeing where God does fit into that, for some people that I know personally, has been a formative part of their faith journey and
right.
coming to faith, and that you can see, I mean, in science and mathematics and all these things that we normally wouldn't realize, like God's handprint.
Oh, I do agree with that.
Over
yeah, for
it.
sure.
Yeah.
And so we're actually going to have an episode on the podcast about that soon. So I think it's interesting that you brought that up, where we do talk about how do faith and science intersect, and where can we take that too far.
I would say, kind of bringing it back to our topic, I don't think that there's a lot of good evidential arguments from this, the science angle. You know what I mean? I think that those kind of fall flat with most people, and a lot of times when I used to be into that, I would be sharing the gospel with somebody, and then it would just turn into an argument about the origin of species, and not like the reliability of the New Testament or
right.
of Jesus being who he said he was. So.
Yeah. I have a few points. I agree with basically everything y'all said. One, science talks about the natural. God is supernatural.
Right.
So you can't put God in a test tube. So I don't think you could use science really to prove God, and I don't even think you could use science to disprove God.
Yeah.
Because, again, as Johnny said, two different spheres that you can't really mesh together. My second point would be remember the gospel. And when you get into debates with people about the origin of species or the Big Bang Theory, you're not talking about the gospel, okay? The gospel is central. Think about people like, there are Christians out there who do believe in evolution, and there are Christians out there who do believe in like a Big Bang. Like Timothy Keller. I mean, he's very solid.
He wandered off the
very
rails.
solid Orthodox pastor and apologist and a theologian who is a theistic evolutionist.
But Ryan, he's a Presbyterian. So
yeah, the true Christians.
So he's not a believer.
Oh my gosh. So it is not even worth it to get in arguments with non-believers about origins, because there are Christians who believe in evolution.
Yes,
evolution. I'm gonna make a very crazy statement. Please don't put me on a stake. Evolution does not necessarily have to contradict Scripture.
Yeah, and
I am not a theistic evolutionist, but I'm perfectly open and welcome to Christians who are.
Yeah, my thing has always been, and Relevant did an article about this, is like, if I found out tomorrow that all the evidence lined up and it was there, it wouldn't shake my faith at all.
Yeah,
right.
Now,
exactly.
I sit here though and go, I don't buy it. I don't. So I just want to say that right now. I'm not a theistic evolutionist either, but it's
right.
It's not a deal breaker.
The important thing is that God created it, right, and that it was perfect at its inception, and then later sin
Which
was
that's
brought
where
into
the
world.
problems come in to actually believing it. So then I'm like, no, I'm good.
But that being said, you're right. Tim Keller's actually one of my favorite preachers and authors. And he does believe that, but it's not, again, he doesn't even spend a bunch of time talking about it.
Right.
Because it's not the main
well,
point.
and I think, and his main point was kind of the point we're making, which is like, we often, I don't know why, but we've often lumped like salvation and your views on this into the same camp.
Yeah.
And I think it's inappropriate.
It is, definitely.
No, it robs you of an opportunity to really talk about what matters
Right.
to somebody.
Well, Jesus never said this is what you have to believe about. By the way, it's like in Acts, where confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and you will be saved as long as you believe in 7-day creation.
Right.
It's like that's the way some Christians teach it.
And it kind of goes back to what we started this season talking about, is like differentiating the essentials from the non-essentials.
Right. That's very important.
So that's a good question.
Yeah. And then the final point I'd make to that is just, as Connor pointed out, if you try and engage in a scientific discussion like that with somebody who really likes science, you're probably going to lose. I know I'm not a science guy. I would lose. I read stuff online all the time, people talking about evolution and stuff, and they're just so much smarter than me. And everything they say may even sound like it makes sense in my mind, even though I don't accept it. I would just not engage, because I know I would lose. And I just trust in God, and that God, as we discussed, created the world and all of that. And so yeah, I would say don't even try and engage in that. Connor, you were going to say something?
So are we basically wrapping up?
Yeah, I think unless you have more stuff you want to talk about.
Well, for me, this is actually, out of the three of them, this one's very personal to me, because I was a skeptic, and it was conversations like this that helped me come around. And it was studying things like this, reading books like The Case for Christ, that started to help me understand and wrap my mind around this thing. And I had actually studied a bunch of different religions. I really had just stepped back, and I wanted to figure out, is God real? And if so, who is he? And we shared our testimonies on an episode recently, so I kind of shared that a little bit. But the thing I want to say with that is coming from a place as somebody who was a skeptic and is now a believer. At the end of the day, while all of these things helped, evidential, apologetics, at the end of the day, the greatest evidence of the gospel for me that actually was the reason I came to Christ was Christians who loved and forgave me unconditionally when I did not deserve it. Because no matter what kind of logical argument you could come up with for the gospel, that could not be explained. That was supernatural. Because I had seen enough to know that was not naturally in the heart of man, to forgive and love unconditionally. There had to be a supernatural source for that kind of love. They were taking the gospel and they were living out the evidence. And I think that's super important to remember. And it even plays into what we were just talking about, because if you just try and argue with somebody about evolution or whatever, and you never show them the love of Christ, you're just going to drive them further away from Christianity.
I remember sitting with a group of men talking about this very thing, about the balance between our own life as an apologetic, and then also having your stuff together about apologetics. And he was telling a story about how he was sitting in a room with a bunch of other guys, telling this guy the gospel, and they were doing all of these apologetic arguments and all these kind of things, and winning the argument, so to speak. And they're like, but still, they weren't getting anywhere with the guy. And finally, they're like, you know what? None of this really matters. Have you ever experienced the love of God, this unconditional type of love? And the guy said, I'm experiencing it right now with you guys.
Oof.
Because you care enough about me to labor in this conversation.
Yeah.
And later that week, he got saved. So it's pretty, so these things are important, but it was actually the love that in the conversation that he felt.
That is the greatest evidence of the gospel.
All right. That's
wonderful.
That's part 2.
So part 3, can we get a little sneak preview? What are we talking about?
All right. I'm going to throw a big word at you. We're going to be talking about presuppositionalism.
Oh, that's fun to say.
That's actually my favorite methodology.
Is it now? Okay.
Yes.
Well,
so I'm very excited.
Lazy.
I'm very excited to talk about it. So.
Well, that's because you're a nerd. So we hope you join us next week for more apologetics on Theology Thursday, and that you have a blessed day.
But Guy.
As always, thank you for listening to Theology Thursday. You can find old episodes on iTunes, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, the Google Play Store, YouTube, and Podbean. You can send questions that you want us to answer on the show to theologythursdaypodcast@gmail.com, and you can also find us on Instagram and Facebook. We hope to have you back next Thursday.